Well, welcome to New Covenant United Methodist Church. My name is Tinker. I'm glad you could join us today.
All right. Well, we're going to continue our series on David. And last week we were introduced to David as a young boy who was going back and forth between Saul's camp and home, singing for Saul to help Saul feel better. And then he ended up on the battlefield when Goliath came out, and he slew Goliath. And so now he's going to end up becoming the commander of Saul's army. But then people are going to begin to sing songs about David and how he's killed his tens of thousands, where Saul has only killed his thousands. And Saul's going to begin to chase him around. And so we're going to pick up now on one day while he's running. So let me go ahead and read our scripture. We're going to take it from 1 Samuel 21 through 22. David came to Nob, to the priest Amalek. Amalek came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to the priest Amalek, "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'No one must know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what have you at hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, only here." The priest answered David, "I have no ordinary bread at hand, only holy bread, provided that the young men have kept themselves from women." David answered the priest, "Indeed, women have been kept from us, as always, when I go out on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is a common journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there except the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord, to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. But one of the sons of Amalek, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord. David said to Abiathar, "I knew on the day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I am responsible for the lives of all your father's house.'" So we need a lot more information than what I have here, but I did not want to read chapter after chapter for you guys. So let's just look at this map just real quick. This is what Saul's going to do for the next several years. He is going to flee from being chased. David. He is going to flee. Actually, Saul too, because Saul is chasing David. So they're both going on this long trip. Some of that you'll notice that David even goes into territory that is not Israelite. He goes into the land of the Philistines, he goes to the land of the Ammonites, and goes into the lands of the Moabites. He's actually going to take his family into the land of the Moabites for fear that Saul might actually retaliate against his family as well. So Saul is becoming more and more jealous, even though after the battle he went ahead and appointed David commander. As the people begin to just love David, he becomes so jealous that he decides to kill David. So David's running, and one day he ends up running to Nob. And there the priests are there, and he goes in and he lies to the priest about what's going on. And the priest is even curious. Why are you here alone? You're usually the head of an army. Why are you here alone? But David doesn't tell him the truth. Loaves of bread, and he lies to him. And after he lies, he takes these loaves of bread and he takes the sword of Goliath as well that had been stored there, and he leaves. But remember, there was someone there named Doeg, the Edomite, and he's the chief of Saul's shepherds. And he's going to go back to Saul's camp, and Saul, after missing David a couple of times, is going to be complaining about, "Why is even my son," at this point David and Saul's son had become very close friends, Jonathan, he said, "Even my son is against me. Everybody's against me," and he just wants to capture David. And Doeg sees his chance, And so he raises his hand and says to Saul, I know where he is. I saw him come to Nob, and the priest gave him provisions. So Saul marches straight to Nob, goes to the priest and say, why did you help David? Now this Amalek's confused. Why wouldn't he help David? He's the king's commander of his army. No one loves Saul more than David. So why wouldn't he help him? But Saul by this point is just so consumed with jealousy that he actually says to his army, slay the priest. They won't do it. They're not going to raise swords against the priest. So he turns to Doeg, who is not actually an Israelite. He's an Edomite, which there's some history and tension between them. And so he does it. And he slays the priest. Except one, the son of Amalek, actually escapes. And he goes to David and he tells David what happened. And he says to him, he slew all the priests. And David responds, it's my fault. I knew that day when I saw Doeg there that he would tell Saul. So this sermon, by the way, I've heard it 1,000 times. And one of the things I've always heard in relation to this, and some of you already know I'm going to go somewhere different, right? Because I always do. This sermon's always preached is why we don't lie, why we never break the 10 Commandments. Because what happened when David lied? People got killed. He didn't give the priest a chance to make up their own mind whether they wanted to help David. He didn't tell them, oh yeah, Saul's trying to kill me and chase me. And if you guys feed me, there's a very good chance he's going to be mad at you guys. He doesn't tell them any of that. Matter of fact, he just flat out lies and says, yeah, I'm here on Saul's business. Saul sent me on a mission, and I'm here. The story of, so he lies, they die, and I often hear this sermon combined with the story of Corrie ten Boom. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Corrie ten Boom, but Corrie ten Boom was Dutch. She was actually a child during World War II, and her family made the decision that they were going to hide Jews in their house. Now, to hide Jews in your house, you had to lie. But her sister, Betsy, absolutely refused to lie. So guess who did not answer the door when the Nazis came and knocked on the door? Betsy, because everybody knew Betsy would tell them. Well, one day, sure enough, they hear the Nazis coming, and so they start hiding the Jews under the table. They actually had a trap door under the table. They open the trap door, put the Jews in, throw a rug down, put the table back over, and hide them. But guess who got to the door first? Betsy. Betsy opens the door, and the Nazi says, are you hiding Jews? And guess what Betsy says? Yes. And they say, well, where are they? Under the table. And believe it or not, this soldier assumed Betsy was making fun of him. That she was being sarcastic or something. So guess where they didn't search? Under the table. They searched the entire house except under the table. So what I always hear when this sermon's preached is that if you always obey God's commandments, people will be rewarded and saved, just like what happened with Betsy and the Jews. But guys, you know what? There's 1,000 stories that didn't get recorded where people told the truth and somebody died. Sometimes we have to make a decision between which is the lesser of two evils. And in this case, lying worked for Betsy, but that doesn't mean that it worked for Dave. I mean, not lying worked for Betsy, but that doesn't mean that it always works. So I'm going to go somewhere a little bit different with this, and what I want to kind of point out is there was actually 2 lies told that day. There was two rules broken. Can't even hardly talk. 2 rules broken that day. And the other one wasn't David. David did one, but the other one, believe it or not, was the priest. The priest Amalek actually broke a rule that day. It was the bread of the presence. So on the table that day was the bread of the presence. And what the bread of the presence is it's 12 loaves. And the loaves represent the 12 tribes. And what the commandment was, and this was a Levitical commandment by Moses, is that they would take 2 rows of 6 loaves of bread and set them on the table every Sabbath day. So on the Sabbath day, they'd be cooked, they'd be warm, they'd be set on the table. And then they would sit there all week. And this was a sign to the Israelites that this was God's provision for Israel, a sign of God's love and how God takes care of Israel by putting the food out on the table. Then the following Sunday, and I just can't imagine how hard those pieces of bread were, but the following Sunday, the priests were allowed to take the old bread off and eat it, and only the priest, and then they put in 12 more fresh loaves. So that day, when David shows up, you remember that map? All that running around David's been doing? He's probably lost a little weight. It probably shows in his face that he's tired, dehydrated. He's obviously been running. And so he's hungry, and he shows up, and he asks for bread, and the priest said, the only bread I've got is this bread you can't have. And David says, I need it. And the priest makes a decision to break the rule and give him the bread as long as they've kept themselves, all the men have kept themselves, they've abstained. I'll just put it that way. So he makes a decision to break a rule. Now, you might argue with me, and rightfully, and say, yeah, but David broke a 10th commandment rule, and the priest just broke a Levitical rule. And I would agree with you, except for the fact that that's not how Jesus looked at it. Jesus actually talks about this story. There's a day where Jesus and the disciples, on a Sabbath day, are walking through a field, and they're also hungry. And they begin to pop grains off the wheat or the barley, I don't remember which it was, and eat them. And of course, all the Pharisees come running out and saying, you have just broken one of the 10 commandments, and that's to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And Jesus says to them, let me tell you a story. And he talks about the day that David was so hungry that he ate this food. And so what Jesus is saying in essence is that when we look at any of the men, the rules, and he ends his story by saying the rules were made for men, not men for the rules. And so what he's saying is the rules are there to help us, to be part of our life, not to take away from our life. And so there are times where we may have to say to ourselves, and please don't take this sermon and run out the door and say, Tinker said we could lie. But there are times where we may have to make a decision and say to ourselves, which is the worst rule to break in this situation? And you'll notice in this one, the celebration that Jesus talks about is what the priest did to help someone. And he doesn't talk about the lie David made just to kind of save himself. And maybe David was trying to save the priest. Maybe he thought by not telling the priest, the priest would be okay. But Jesus talks about this one as a way of saying this is what we should do. We put life before we put rules. The rules are there to give us life, not to take away from life. So we're going to do whatever we can. But I want to go a little bit further with this too, because one of the things I really want to kind of talk about is how David responds to this. And the great thing is David was writing Psalms during this time. As he was running around and trying to evade Saul, he was writing these Psalms. Now, I can't imagine how David felt that day when he found out all 85 of those priests had been killed because of the decision he made. That's heartbreaking. absolutely a heartbreaking thing to have happen. And so he wrote this psalm actually about it. And I'm just going to read part of the psalm and to kind of talk about his reaction to it. And so he starts out and he says, "Why do you boast, O mighty one, O mischief done against the godly? All day long you are plotting destruction. Your tongue is like a sharp razor, you worker of treachery." So there he's talking about Doeg. Then he goes down, he said, "But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living." And then he goes on to talk about himself. And he says, "But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever." So what David could have done that day is really just kind of fallen into despair. Guilt could have just overwhelmed him. I'm useless. What he'd done and just thought, man, I screwed up. I'm useless. I'm not going to do this stuff anymore, and just found a cave and set it out. But he doesn't. And so let me flip my slide here. There we go. This is how David actually responds. The first thing we see is that he owns his mistake. He says, "I am responsible. This is my fault." So he owns it. He acknowledges it's definitely what he did. He caused it. It's his fault. But then he actually also, and these kind of go together, he takes responsibility for it, and he tells the son of the priest, he says, "I want you to stay with me, and I will take care of you. I will watch over you now. This is my fault, and I will now be responsible for you." And then he moves on, though, and we see this in the psalm, he lets it go. And he starts this psalm out by, so it was his fault in some extent, but who actually put them to death? It wasn't David. It was Doeg. He didn't actually do it. Doeg did it. He might have been part of the catalyst. He acknowledges that. But ultimately, he doesn't do it. And so in this psalm, we see he puts the blame on Doeg. He recognizes, yeah, I do have some responsibility here, but I did not thrust a sword into these guys. Someone else did that. And then he trusts that God will take care of that. He sees that God will break you down forever. He will snatch you and tear you from the tent. So he allows God now to be the one that's going to take revenge. He's going, okay, I screwed up. I did this. Doeg, though, was the one who actually killed him. And now, God, whatever you decide, however you want to take care of this, I trust and know that Doeg is going to answer to you. He doesn't need to answer to me. He's going to answer to you. And then he goes on, and I love this part here. This is where he's letting it go. "But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God." A green olive tree is a young, vital tree. It's a young, strong tree. It's growing. So what he's saying is, use me. I'm in your service. I still want to be part of whatever you're doing in this world. Instead of saying, "Oh man, I'm just a worn out thorn, useless weed. God, just pluck me and throw me away." Instead, he says, "I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever." I don't know how many of us have at some point in our lives done something we really regretted. We've hurt somebody. We've said something or done somebody that has caused somebody else to experience something really bad. And whether you believe in the devil or not, there is a voice that will come to you and say, "You remember when you did this? Remember when you did that?" No sense in you being involved in any kind of ministry. No sense in you being a hand or a foot for God. God can't use you. This was telling us that. But yes, God does want to use us, because what Jesus was telling us that day when he retold this story is that your life is worth something to him. Your life is worth more than the rule you broke. And he wants you to live. He wants you to acknowledge it, ask for forgiveness, and then trust Him with the rest of it. And now turn yourself over to Him and be a young, useful, growing tree, full of life, full of fruit still to bear. If we wallow in our self-pity and all the guilt that the enemy loves to throw at us, then we might as well be a weed and somebody might as well pluck us. But David recognized that he still had a lot to offer God, that he still had so much that he could do if he let that go. I challenge us, let God handle it and let it go. So that's what I challenge us to do today, is if we've got some things that just kind of guilt that keeps coming back and circling back, saying, you know what, God, I want to be part of your work in this world. I want to be useful. I want to be helpful. I want to live. I promise you, God is more interested in letting you live than He is in the rule you broke, which He's already forgotten about, by the way, because He promised.